All right, world historians, we are now going to start down the path to civilization. And we're going to do that with the Neolithic Revolution. So the Neolithic Revolution. This this revolution of sorts is actually more of an evolution because it takes a really long time. It's not like a 5-year thing. This is something that's occurring over thousands of years. And the basic the the basic idea of the Neolithic Revolution, or as it's oftentimes called, the Agricultural Revolution, is the domestication of plants and animals. Why would people want to do that when they were doing just fine as hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years? Well, as a hunter-gatherer, you can't really have a surplus, and so the main benefit to having domesticated plants and animals is that it allows you to have a path to a surplus of food. This is not necessarily, actually, no, it's definitely not less work. It's definitely not easier, but it is a way to get people diversified in terms of their occupations. So, people basically found two paths in this time period. First, the first path is the agriculturalists. Agriculturalists are settled people. They do not move around. And this is because they are farmers. So they are focusing on cultivating crops and animals like chickens. So this is where we get the idea of domestication. So these are crops that are specifically they're specifically like modified, I guess you could say, by humans or bred. This is the first example of my terrible spelling. They're bred by humans for specific traits. I guess the easiest way to think about this is with the domestication of dogs, but people do this with plants as well. The reason I say it's really easy to see with dogs is because different breeds of dogs generally have different purposes. So herders, retrievers, terriers, like they all are kind of bred for specific traits for a specific function. This group really changed the environment. So, for example, people who were agriculturalists tended to get rid of trees because they needed open areas to plant their crops. So there was some deforestation, and and also just building urban areas too. But one of the biggest things that they did was that they made irrigation systems. So why would you make an irrigation system? Well, because your crops need water to grow, and if you're not getting it all the time, you need to supply that water to them all the time so that they can grow. So you're using crops need water, so typically you're setting up these irrigation systems, and typically they're near rivers because that's an easy way to do it. So what type of crops are we looking at here? Mainly we're thinking about cereal crops like wheat or barley, or in the case of Latin America, maize, or the Americas. And really, this depended, the type of crops and animals that you had depended on your region. So whatever was happening locally, that was available to you, was what you were going to use. Okay? So some places had chickens, some places had cattle. The place that had the most things that were easy to domesticate just by geographic luck was Mesopotamia. So they hit that geographic jackpot. Now, the other thing that people would do is they would, instead of settling, they would live kind of a nomadic existence. So they were using like portable homes, and they would have like a yurt. That's what you see here. And they would have domesticated animals like cattle, horses, sheep, goats, etc. Animals that needed to graze. Why would they be moving around? Because these animals tended to deplete the surrounding land with grazing. So you would have to move to get fresh grass, basically. So that's how they were changing the environment. It wasn't as drastic as like irrigation systems, but it was still changing the environment. These groups tended to be more egalitarian than agriculturalists. And that just means that there were less social classes or differences between social classes. All right, so now we're going to look at a map of how this looks, or how this looked in different areas. Now, you might not be able to read this map very well, but it is in your book in chapter 1. So if you want to use that for reference. But you can see, like, this map does a really great job of showing what was domesticated where. And I'll try to show you. So, like, for example, in West Africa, there was yams, okra, and black-eyed peas. In Mesoamerica, it's maize, beans, peppers, squash, and tomatoes. East Asia, you have food crops and animals. So this is in the Yangtze. It's rice, millet, soybeans, and pigs, chickens, water buffaloes. Southeast Asia, this is Mesopotamia. Wheat, barley, domesticated animals, sheep, goats, pig, cattle. So you had people who were pastoralists living alongside agriculturalists. And I guess the example that a lot of you will be familiar with there is the Israelites in Mesopotamia, who were pastoralists living alongside agriculturalists. Okay, so this had a bunch of impacts that is going to lead us to civilization. The Neolithic Revolution did. Number one, you had an increase of population. This was mainly due to the fact that people didn't have to move around all the time. So settled society led to an increase in population. Because you had an increase in population and surplus of food, you could have people not farming, and those people could take on other occupations. So your non-farmers became artisans, metallurgists, who are just people who work with metal. whatever metallurgy or technology you have around metal. This is also when slavery begins, and typically slavery revolved around prisoners of war or debtors. So that was a way for you to pay off your debt to society. Oops, not debaters. It was, I guess that's right. No, well, whatever. So if you had a lot of debt, that's what I'm trying to say. If you then you might be enslaved instead of going to jail, because there weren't very many jails. So that was a good option for people to inflict punishment on those that were either debtors or criminals. So I apologize for my horrendous spelling on debtors. I'm a little rusty apparently. All right, so this also resulted in social classes. So depending on your occupation, you might have different wealth or social status. So like certain people like priests had a lot more status. Not necessarily more money, but definitely more status than someone like a farmer. So there were different social classes, and these different social classes filled different roles in society. And this is also when we see patriarchy coming into existence, which is male-dominated society. And we'll talk more about that in class and hopefully later on in this video too. Because you had a lot of people doing different jobs, there were a lot of technological innovations, and there were a lot of labor-saving devices. And you can really see these below. So there was pottery. This is from the Jomo people. Plows for farming, woven textiles, which were really beautiful, like blankets and rugs and such. Metallurgy, again, working with metals, whatever metals you had around. Wheels. Whoa! Wheels come from, well, actually, it's always been taught that they come from Mesopotamia, but now there's some friction on that. So I'm going to put Mesopotamia. We'll think about that. And wheeled vehicles. Typically, these settlements, the earliest settlement is Çatalhöyük. You can see it's not very organized. And then this is Jericho. It's much, much more looks like a city we would think of today. There are different areas. Open areas, closed off areas, and then typically the city would be surrounded by a wall for protection. But these earliest settlements were very messy, I guess you could say. And there's an example of pottery from the Jomo people. Okay, so in our next video, we are going to move on and we're going to look at civilizations.